Honeysuckle Inn by Catherine Waltan. Chapter 1. A Sweet Escape. Helen Lighthall eased her aging station wagon into the gravel driveway of Honeysuckle Inn, her hands gently gripping the wheel as if it were a delicate pie crust. The inn sat nestled among wild rose bushes and tall oak trees, its buttercream yellow siding trimmed in white, like piped frosting on a cake. A wooden sign swung slightly in the spring breeze. Honeysuckle Inn, established 1887, where comfort is homemade. From the back seat came an enthusiastic bark, followed by a low, grumbly woof. "I know, boys," Helen said, glancing in the rearview mirror at Halo and Shadow, her two Labrador retrievers, one a bounding golden sunbeam, the other a brooding shadow with soulful eyes. "We're finally here." She parked beside a row of hydrangeas blooming in shades of blush and violet, then opened the car door. Immediately, Halo leapt out with the grace of a gazelle and dashed toward the garden. Shadow emerged with slower dignity, giving Helen a look that said, "This better be worth the car ride." "Let's not scare the guests," she called after Halo, who had already nosed his way into a flower bed. The air was scented with lilacs and the faint promise of chocolate. Helen had read glowing reviews about Honeysuckle Inn's weekend baking retreat. After the whirlwind of helping solve 2 murders back home in Maplewood, a getaway filled with flour, frosting, and maybe a little peace and quiet sounded like just the ticket. Before she could even close the car door, the front porch creaked, and a voice called out warm and theatrical, "Welcome to Honeysuckle Inn. You must be Helen." A woman in her late 60s descended the stairs in a flurry of turquoise shawl and silver bangles. Her gray-streaked curls bounced with every step. "Beatrice Langford," the woman said, clasping Helen's hand in both of hers. "I'm the innkeeper, baker, hostess, and chaos coordinator, and these must be your lovely companions." "They're Labradors," Helen said. "The yellow one is Halo, the brooding one is Shadow." "Oh, they're perfect," Beatrice cooed. "We're dog-friendly, of course, just not chocolate fountain-friendly." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Is that a warning or an appetizer?" Beatrice winked. "You'll see. Come, I'll show you to your room. You're in the rose room, pink everything, but I promise it's tastefully done." As they walked up the porch steps, Helen took in the scene. The inn buzzed gently with energy. Other guests were arriving, carrying overnight bags, boxes of baking tools, and in one case, a crate labeled Vegan Ganache Emergency Kit. A curly-haired man in a cherry-patterned apron stood by the front door arguing with someone on his Bluetooth. A tall woman in designer sunglasses snapped selfies beside a fountain. The weekend was shaping up to be colorful. The Rose Room lived up to its name. Pale pink walls, a rose-printed duvet, and a teacup collection lined up on a shelf like polite soldiers. The windows overlooked the back garden, where daffodils nodded in the breeze. Helen dropped her bag and gave a content sigh. "All right, boys," she said to her dogs, who had immediately claimed the rug. "This is paradise. No crime scenes, no nosy neighbors, just butter and joy." A knock came at the door. Beatrice peeked in. "Orientation starts in 10 minutes in the sunroom. There'll be cocoa and lemon bars." 10 minutes later, Helen found herself seated in the inn sunroom with a steaming mug of cocoa and a lemon bar so tart it made her cheeks tingle. Around her, a small crowd of fellow retreat-goers chatted, some more animated than others. Beatrice stood at the front, arms wide like a maestro before an orchestra. "Welcome, sweet spirits, to the Honeysuckle Inn baking retreat. This weekend, we'll learn to temper chocolate, sculpt marzipan, and most importantly, embrace the joy of baking from the heart." The room offered polite applause, except for one man who sneezed dramatically into a silk handkerchief and muttered something about sugar sensitivity. "Let's introduce ourselves," Beatrice said. "Name, where you're from, and what dessert describes your personality." Helen cringed slightly but played along. "I'm Helen," she said when it was her turn, "from Maplewood, and I suppose I'm a lemon tart, sweet on the outside, sharp when necessary." A ripple of chuckles ran through the room. Introductions continued. Chad Greenlee, the influencer, who compared himself to a French macaron, stylish, complicated, and worth the hype. Margot Winter, the famed food critic, called herself a molten lava cake, refined and prone to eruption. Teresa Mayweather, a rival baker from a neighboring town, who coolly announced she was creme brulee, traditional, but not to be messed with. Helen's ears perked up. She recognized Teresa's name. Maplewood's own gossip queen, Ida, had mentioned her once during a particularly juicy bridge club rant. Teresa had lost a bakery competition 2 years ago and blamed sabotage. She had that tight-lipped look of someone who still resented it. Then came Emily Langford, Beatrice's niece. She was in her 20s, with dark curls and a guarded expression. "I'm just here to help my aunt," she said, skipping the dessert metaphor entirely. Beatrice shot her a pointed look, but said nothing. When introductions ended, Beatrice clapped her hands. "You'll find your schedules on the foyer table. Tomorrow morning, chocolate tempering in the kitchen. The chocolate fountain showcase is tomorrow night. You'll get to try your hand at creating chocolate sculptures and decorations. And yes, we have aprons." The room dispersed slowly, guests collecting folders and dessert samples. Helen lingered by the chocolate fountain, which had already been assembled in the corner of the sunroom. It was a 3-tiered marvel of polished chrome, not yet running, but impressive. A placard read, "Do not touch without staff supervision." "Chocolate fountain?" Helen murmured. What could possibly go wrong? That night, after a stroll around the gardens with Halo and Shadow, Helen sat in bed, reading the recipe packet left on her pillow. It included tips on ganache, piping techniques, and how to write happy birthday without crying into the buttercream. A soft knock startled her. She opened the door to find Emily holding a tray with a mug of lavender milk and a scone. "Aunt Beatrice asked me to bring this," she said flatly. "She likes guests to feel pampered." Helen accepted the tray, but before she could thank her, Emily added in a low voice, "Don't believe everything you hear this weekend. Some people have long memories." With that, she turned and walked down the hall, her shadow stretching behind her in the flickering light. Helen stood for a moment, frowning slightly. It seemed that even here, at a quiet country inn with lemon bars and lavender milk, something wasn't quite right. Down below, the chocolate fountain waited in silence. Chapter 2: Flour, Frosting, and Friction. The morning sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains, casting golden stripes across Helen's rose-printed bedspread. The scent of brewing coffee and warm cinnamon wafted through the halls, rousing her from a sleep filled with odd dreams, half chocolate river, half whispered threats. Halo was already at the door, tail thumping like a drum roll, while Shadow remained curled at the foot of the bed, giving her a look that said, "5 more minutes, please." All right, Helen murmured, throwing on her cardigan and stretching. "Let's get to the kitchen before someone else snags the last bear claw." Downstairs, the kitchen was a vision of chaos. Copper pots gleamed from hanging racks, flour dusted nearly every surface, and guests bustled about, armed with whisks, spatulas, and confused expressions. Beatrice stood at the head of the long farmhouse table, like a general ready for pastry battle. "Welcome, sweet spirits. Today we dive into the fine and fickle art of chocolate tempering. Please don your aprons. If you mess it up, that's all right. We'll just say it's rustic." Laughter rippled around the room, though not all of it was genuine. Helen noticed that Margot Winter, the food critic, was already frowning at the provided equipment like it had offended her. Teresa Mayweather stood stiffly near the stove, clutching her own monogrammed spatula like a weapon. The influencer, Chad Greenlee, was busy setting up his phone on a tiny tripod, whispering affirmations to the camera. "This is Chad with Choco Chad TV, live from the legendary Honeysuckle Inn," he said, flashing a rehearsed grin, "where the fudge meets the fabulous." Helen suppressed a laugh. Shadow gave a low huff of disapproval, as if he too had had enough of Chad before he'd even begun. Pairings were randomly assigned. Helen found herself stationed beside Emily Langford, who looked even more tired than she had the night before. "Rough night?" Helen asked as they began chopping dark chocolate into shards. Emily shrugged. "This place never sleeps. Aunt Beatrice is always running around at 3 a.m. checking ovens. She says it's baker's intuition. More like insomnia. Helen smiled gently. Still, she seems to care deeply about this place, and you. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she stirred the chocolate slowly over a double boiler, her posture tense. Sorry, Helen said, sensing she'd hit a nerve. Didn't mean to pry. No offense, I just didn't want to come back here. Helen's brows rose. Back? I used to live here before college. My mom, Beatrice's sister, moved us away after a big fight. I haven't seen Aunt Bee in almost 10 years. She invited me out of the blue last month, said she wanted to reconnect. And you came? Emily gave a wry smile. I'm not sure why. Maybe to see if she'd changed. Before Helen could respond, a sharp voice cut through the kitchen. Careful, those are Valrhona beans. You're overstirring and breaking the crystals. Teresa snapped at her partner, a timid retiree named Marlene. It's just chocolate, Marlene murmured, shrinking under Teresa's glare. No, Teresa barked. It's tempered chocolate. There's a difference. Maybe you should temper your attitude, someone muttered nearby. Chad, probably. He was live-streaming their awkward exchange with glee. Beatrice clapped her hands. Let's channel that energy into truffles, shall we? By mid-morning, the kitchen smelled like every chocolate lover's fantasy. The guests had shaped bonbons, piped ganache, and laughed, mostly. But under the cheer lingered an edge. Helen saw it in sideways glances and muttered comments, in Margot's raised eyebrow as she sampled someone else's truffle and declared it too peasant-like, and in Teresa's passive-aggressive observations about the amateur hour unfolding around her. Beatrice, meanwhile, moved through it all with surprising energy, offering praise here, adjusting a technique there, and ignoring the tension coiling between her guests. You're quite the ringmaster, Helen said when Beatrice passed her station. Beatrice winked. Keeping this circus running is what I do. Just wait for tonight's chocolate fountain showcase. That's when the real drama usually begins. She was joking, but Helen couldn't shake the sense that something deeper brewed beneath Beatrice's smile, a whisper of tension, a flicker of worry. After lunch, quiche, arugula salad, and more chocolate, the group assembled in the sunroom for an informal Q&A with Beatrice. She perched on a velvet armchair near the fireplace, sipping espresso from a delicate china cup. Halo flopped at her feet, fully won over by her earlier offering of a bacon scrap. Someone asked about her most famous dessert, and Beatrice launched into a story about baking for the governor's daughter's wedding. Another guest asked about her time studying pastries in Paris. As the conversation flowed, it shifted into more personal territory. Beatrice, Margot said, her tone sugar-coated but sharp, I've heard whispers that some of your signature recipes bear a striking resemblance to those found in Pâtisserie Moderne, published in 1996. Care to comment? A collective hush fell. Helen tensed. Shadow growled under his breath. Beatrice's smile never wavered. You mean the book co-written by Simone Fournier, my mentor? Margot sipped her tea. I mean the book you weren't credited in. The silence thickened. Beatrice sat forward slightly, her voice calm. Simone and I collaborated for years. I chose not to pursue credit because I was opening this inn. She went to Paris. I stayed here. Teresa snorted from the back of the room. Sounds more like she took your recipes. Beatrice's gaze flicked to her. It's funny. Some people believe stealing a recipe is worse than stealing a heart. The inn grew quiet. Helen cleared her throat. Well, wherever the recipes came from, they're delicious. That lemon bar might have changed my life. A few people laughed, tension easing. Margot offered a half smile. I suppose time sweetens old stories. Still, credit matters. Beatrice stood, her smile now brittle. And some things are best left in the past. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on the fountain for tonight. She exited the room with surprising speed, Halo trotting after her like a furry shadow. Helen exchanged a glance with Emily, who was staring at the empty doorway. That hit a nerve, Helen said quietly. Emily nodded. Margot's not wrong. Aunt Bee's past has knots. You think she stole the recipes? I think she's capable of things I don't fully understand. That evening, the chocolate fountain stood in the center of the sunroom, surrounded by platters of strawberries, shortbread, and marshmallows. Guests arrived in semi-formal attire, aprons swapped for scarves and polished shoes. Beatrice wore a shimmering blouse and velvet pants, her silver curls pinned elegantly. Tonight, she announced, we celebrate chocolate and the joy it brings to all of us. Dip wisely, friends. As the fountain whirred to life, rich dark chocolate cascading like a satin waterfall, Helen marveled at the transformation of the space. Music drifted from hidden speakers, laughter bounced between walls. But not everyone was cheerful. Teresa hovered near the window, a glass of wine in hand, her eyes scanning the crowd. Margot circled like a hawk, dipping and critiquing each item. Chad filmed close-ups of the fountain for his followers. Emily stood alone near the fire, sipping something non-alcoholic. Helen nibbled on a chocolate-covered biscotti, keeping her eyes open. Years of teaching had taught her how to read rooms, and this room hummed with more than excitement. Beatrice stood near the fountain, accepting compliments and dodging subtle jabs with the grace of a seasoned hostess. But her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. At one point she caught Helen's eye across the room, and for just a moment, barely a breath, her smile faltered. Later, back in her room, Helen sat cross-legged on the bed while Halo and Shadow snoozed at her feet. She scribbled a few notes in her journal, a habit she'd picked up since her first case in Maplewood. Suspicious things so far. Emily's resentment, Beatrice's tension, recipe theft accusation, Teresa's sharp tongue, Margot's probing questions, everyone pretending to like each other while secretly fuming. She underlined that last one twice. From downstairs came the soft hum of cleanup, dishes clinking, doors closing, then silence. Until the clock struck midnight. And then, a scream. Chapter 3, Death by Chocolate. The scream pierced the silence like a knife through fondant. Helen bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. Halo barked, already charging toward the door with his nails clicking against the hardwood. Shadow let out a low growl, his ears perked and ready. Helen didn't wait for an invitation. She pulled on her robe and slippers, grabbed her flashlight from the nightstand, and hurried out into the hallway. The air was thick, dense with the eerie stillness that only follows a scream. Voices erupted from the second floor as guests peeked out of their rooms. Doors creaked open. Someone shouted, "What was that?" Another called out, "Is everyone all right?" Helen pushed through the murmuring confusion, her flashlight guiding her down the stairs to the first floor. She could already see the warm flicker of lamplight glowing from the sunroom ahead. She rounded the corner and stopped dead. Beatrice Langford lay face down in the chocolate fountain. Her silver curls floated on the dark surface, stained brown. One of her bangles glinted in the warm light, but her arm remained motionless. The once elegant display now resembled a macabre centerpiece, decadent, surreal, and horrifying. Emily was the one screaming. She stood nearby, frozen, her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and something deeper. Shadow whined beside her, nudging her leg gently. Helen rushed forward. "Emily, don't touch her!" "I didn't," she gasped. I just came down for water. I saw the lights. She was already... Helen? Sheriff Mike's voice called from the front entrance. A few seconds later, he strode in, boots heavy on the floor, his uniform slightly rumpled as if he'd been halfway to bed himself. "I got the call just now," he said, assessing the room. "Emergency dispatch said someone reported a scream." "What? Oh." He stopped as his eyes landed on Beatrice's body. Helen gave a brief nod. "She's gone." Mike approached carefully, waving back the growing crowd of half-dressed guests huddled in the hallway behind them. "No one touches anything," he said firmly. "Everyone back upstairs. I need to secure the scene." "But that's Beatrice," Chad Greenlee said from the hallway, clutching a phone and filming over someone's shoulder. "She can't be... This is not the kind of content I post." Mike leveled him with a look. "Put your phone away, or I'll put it in a place you won't like. Upstairs, now." The crowd reluctantly dispersed. Helen stayed put, watching Mike examine the area with a professional calm that she had come to admire during their previous escapades. He crouched beside the fountain and gently checked Beatrice's wrist for a pulse, though it was clear she was long gone. "There's no sign of struggle nearby," he said, "but she's fully submerged. Unusual for someone to accidentally drown in a chocolate fountain." "I don't think it was an accident," Helen said softly. He looked up. "You saw something?" "No, but Beatrice wasn't drunk, she wasn't clumsy, and she certainly wouldn't have stuck her head in the fountain. Not voluntarily." Mike sighed, then stood. "Which means we've got a crime scene." The rest of the night blurred into a series of official procedures. Deputies arrived. The inn's entrance was taped off. The guests were formally interviewed and instructed not to leave. The fountain was shut down, its rich aroma now tainted with the metallic tang of tragedy. Helen, unable to sleep, sat on a bench outside the kitchen as the early hours crept on. Dawn was still a whisper on the horizon. Shadow lay beside her, head on his paws. Halo patrolled the walkway like a fluffy security guard. She replayed the night in her mind. Beatrice's cheerful welcome, her tension during the Q&A, the way her smile had faltered after Margot's accusation, and the strange things Emily had said. She didn't want to suspect Emily. Not yet. But she'd seen grief, and this wasn't it. Shock, yes. Horror, definitely. But guilt? That was another flavor altogether. By 7 a.m., breakfast was canceled and the kitchen was closed. Most guests wandered aimlessly, their morning routines disrupted by the overnight tragedy. Helen poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the sideboard and joined a few of the others in the drawing room. Margot sat in a wing-back chair, impeccably dressed and sipping tea as though it were a regular Sunday morning. Teresa stood near the window, staring out with arms crossed. Chad scrolled on his phone, muttering to himself. "I've got over 12,000 views on the clip I posted before the sheriff made me delete it. Think I can repost if I blur the body?" "Have you no decency?" Marlene, the timid retiree, asked with wide eyes. "I'm an influencer," Chad replied smugly. "This is content." Helen ignored the squabbling and turned to Margot. "You knew Beatrice, didn't you?" Margot looked up over the rim of her teacup. "Professionally. We crossed paths in the culinary scene years ago." "You accused her of stealing recipes." Margot's lips thinned. "I merely asked a question, one that circulated for a long time." "Did you come here hoping to stir up trouble?" Teresa snorted. "Margot doesn't stir, she simmers." "I came for the chocolate," Margot replied coolly, "and perhaps to see if Beatrice would finally admit her past." Helen studied her for a moment. "And now she can't." Margot's gaze didn't waver. "Unfortunate, isn't it?" Mike called a meeting in the parlor that afternoon. The guests gathered, weary and curious, some still in loungewear, others already packing. "I appreciate everyone's cooperation," he began. "We're treating Beatrice's death as suspicious. We'll need to keep the premises closed for the next 24 hours while we investigate." A wave of discontent rippled through the room. "You're keeping us here?" Chad asked. "Dude, I have a sponsorship shoot tomorrow. My brand is depending on—" "Someone died," Emily said sharply, her voice hoarse. "My aunt died. Can we stop talking about your brand?" "Do we know what happened to her?" Teresa asked. "Surely she didn't just fall in." "No evidence points to an accident," Mike replied. "Toxicology is underway. Preliminary scans show no blunt force trauma, but we'll know more once we get the autopsy report." "Could she have had a heart attack?" Marlene asked, wringing her hands. "She was in good health," Emily said. "No medications, no conditions." "And she wasn't clumsy," Helen added. "She was poised, careful." Mike nodded toward her. "Which is why we're treating this as foul play." Teresa raised a skeptical brow. "So one of us did it?" No one spoke. Mike continued. "For now, we'd appreciate if everyone stayed on the premises. Deputies will be stationed at the drive. If anyone remembers anything, strange noises, suspicious behavior, please come forward." He dismissed the group, but not before casting a meaningful glance at Helen. She gave a slight nod. Their unspoken agreement was in effect. Another case, another mystery, another chance to find the truth. Helen returned to her room and found Emily sitting on the floor outside, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I didn't kill her," Emily said quietly. "I didn't say you did. I know what people are thinking. I argued with her. We barely knew each other. I left years ago." Helen sat beside her. "What brought you back?" "She called, said she missed me, that she wanted to tell me something important. But last night, I don't know. She seemed distracted." "Did she tell you what it was?" Emily shook her head. "No, but I think it had to do with the inn. And her will." Helen's brow rose. "Her will?" "She said she was rewriting it. That some people wouldn't like what was in the new version. Did you see the new copy?" "No, I asked to, but she brushed me off, said we'd talk after the retreat." Helen exhaled slowly. A motive was starting to take shape. Inheritance, secrets, long-held grudges. And then there was the note in Beatrice's recipe journal, the one Helen had flipped through yesterday before the showcase. Hadn't there been something about regrets and unfinished business? She'd need to take another look. Later that evening, Helen slipped into the now quiet kitchen. The air still smelled faintly of cocoa and vanilla, though the joy had been baked out of it. She searched the shelf above the prep counter and found Beatrice's journal exactly where it had been. It was a thick, well-worn book with hand-drawn doodles of bundt cakes and cupcakes in the margins. Helen flipped through until she found the page with the odd entry, "Too long I've waited. Emily deserves to know. The recipe isn't the only thing she inherited. If anything happens to me, it's all in the red tin under the garden steps." Helen's heart skipped a beat. She snapped the book shut and slipped it under her arm. Outside, the sky had turned to charcoal. Fireflies blinked in the hedges as she tiptoed down the garden path, halo and shadow trailing quietly behind her. The garden steps were near the arbor, 4 stone slabs partially overgrown with moss and vines. She crouched, brushing the foliage aside, until she felt something cold and metallic beneath her fingers. A red tin. She pulled it out carefully and opened the lid. Inside were 2 folded documents, a faded photograph of Beatrice and a younger woman, possibly Simone Fournier, and a thumb drive labeled Backups. Helen opened the first document. It was a copy of a new will, one that left the inn to Emily, and nothing to the Langford cousins who had supposedly helped build the business. In the margins, Beatrice had written in red ink, "Destroy older copy before the weekend." The second document was a letter, unsent, addressed to Emily. "Dear Em, I was wrong to keep this from you. Your mother and I had a falling out, yes, but the truth is this place was always meant for you. The recipe book, it's yours too. Simone and I built something beautiful, and I want you to have it. If anything happens to me, don't trust Teresa. She's already tried once. I believe she'll try again." Helen's breath caught. Teresa. She closed the tin, her thoughts racing. It was time to have a very careful conversation with the creme brulee baker. Chapter 4. A Sticky Situation. Helen stood in the shadow of the arbor, the red tin clutched in her hands, the words of Beatrice's letter still echoing in her mind. Don't trust Teresa. She's already tried once. The night air was crisp, tinged with honeysuckle and something sharper, maybe anticipation. Halo paced in small, energetic circles beside her, while Shadow sat perfectly still, ears twitching. She slid the tin back into its hiding place under the stone step. She'd show it to Sheriff Mike in the morning, but tonight, she needed to make sense of things. Beatrice had been afraid, paranoid even, but she hadn't been wrong. Not with a body in the chocolate fountain, and now, Teresa was squarely in the middle of it all. Helen rose and brushed the dirt off her knees, her mind whirling. She didn't want to believe the famous baker was capable of murder, but the signs were there: grudges, jealousy, past conflict with Beatrice, and now a name in a letter warning of violence. She looked down at her dogs. What do you think, boys? Time to stir the pot? Halo barked once. Shadow simply stood and started toward the inn. Back inside, the air was heavy with hush. The kitchen lights were low, the sunroom roped off by crime scene tape, and most of the guests had retired to their rooms, or were pretending to. Teresa, however, was not. Helen found her in the library, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, paging through a vintage cookbook as though nothing had happened. A half-drunk glass of red wine sat on the end table beside her. "You're up late," Helen said, stepping into the room. Teresa looked up, her lips twitching into a tight smile. "And you're lurking." "I was walking the garden. Needed air." Teresa closed the book. "I find cooking manuals oddly calming. Perhaps it's the order, the simplicity. Everything follows a formula." "Except life," Helen said. "Especially life," Teresa replied. "Though I try." Helen took a seat across from her. "You and Beatrice had history." Teresa's smile didn't fade, but her eyes darkened. "Everyone here has history with Beatrice. She collected frenemies like some people collect porcelain cats." "Did you resent her?" "I respected her." She took a sip of wine. "But yes, I resented her too. She made it impossible for anyone else in this region to succeed in the pastry world without being compared to her. I opened my bakery 10 miles away, and still people said, 'Oh, have you tried Beatrice's version of this eclair?' It was maddening." "You ever think about getting even?" Teresa leaned forward slightly. "Is that what you're asking? Whether I killed her? Drowned her in the dessert she loved most?" "Beatrice thought you might." Teresa blinked. "Excuse me?" "She left a letter. Said you'd tried before." The room fell still. Even the fire crackled more softly. Finally, Teresa sighed. "If you're referring to the article she submitted anonymously to discredit me during a food festival 4 years ago, I considered legal action. She tried to get my bakery shut down over a minor food permit violation. But that was business. We made peace, after a fashion." Helen raised an eyebrow. "And if she had a new will? One that excluded certain people? Maybe people who felt they were owed something?" Teresa stared at her for a long moment, then leaned back in the chair. "Are you accusing me of murder, Helen?" "No," Helen said. "I'm watching how you respond to the idea." Teresa's eyes narrowed. "You may fancy yourself a sleuth, but you're a baker with a nose for drama. Be careful where you sniff." And with that she rose, took her wine, and walked out, her heels clicking like punctuation marks behind her. The next morning dawned gray and misty. Rain threatened to fall, and the birds seemed unusually quiet. Helen stood with Mike on the porch of the inn, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee and watching the deputies finish sealing the sunroom. "I found this last night," she said, handing him the tin. Mike opened it slowly, skimming the documents with a practiced eye. When he reached the letter and the note about Teresa, he let out a long, slow exhale. She really was worried. She believed someone might hurt her before she could change her will. Mike shook his head. "And now the old will's missing. Emily says it was kept in the office safe, but the safe was empty when we checked this morning." "Who knew the combination?" "Just Beatrice, but that doesn't help us now." Helen sighed. She trusted Emily, but the rest of her family? She didn't mention them by name in the new will. "Then we'll need to talk to them, and soon." As they turned to go inside, a silver Audi pulled into the gravel driveway, kicking up dust. 2 sharply dressed women emerged, both in their 40s, both wearing expressions carved from stone. "Langford cousins," Mike muttered. Helen followed his gaze. "Looks like the sharks smelled blood." The cousins, Delilah and Charlotte Langford, breezed into the inn as if they still owned part of it, which perhaps they believed they did. "We came as soon as we heard," Delilah said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Beatrice was family. We're devastated." Charlotte added, "And we wanted to check on the estate. Naturally." Mike didn't hide his skepticism. "There's an ongoing investigation. You're not permitted access to any private files, assets, or records until further notice. We're entitled to view the contents of the will, Charlotte insisted. Once the will is verified, Mike replied. Until then, I suggest you make yourselves comfortable. Quietly. The cousins exchanged a look, then flounced into the parlor, muttering about small-town nonsense and lawyers on speed dial. Helen leaned closer to Mike. I take it they're not Emily's biggest fans? They've been circling this place for years, waiting for Beatrice to hand it over. Now it seems they're out of the picture. Helen nodded. Unless they got wind of the new will before anyone else. Mike's jaw tightened. We need more than motives. We need evidence. Helen wandered back to the kitchen and found Emily sitting at the counter with a stack of unopened sympathy cards and a blank notebook. I can't do this, she said quietly as Helen approached. The guests, the lawyers, the looks. You don't have to do it alone. Emily looked up. I'm not like her. I'm not made of sugar and sass and steel. She filled this house with life. I don't even know where the light switches are. You'll figure it out. I wish I'd come back sooner. Helen sat down. She wanted to make things right with you. That matters. And she left everything to you. That matters too. Emily looked down at the notebook. Do you think one of the guests did it? I think everyone has something to hide. A moment passed. Then softly Emily said, A few days ago, Aunt Bee told me she thought someone had been in her room. She found her drawers open, papers missing. She brushed it off, but now... Helen straightened. She didn't tell Mike that. She didn't want to make trouble, but she knew. I think she was scared. Helen's mind raced. If someone had searched Beatrice's room, it was likely they were after the new will or evidence of it. If they hadn't found it in the safe, they may have kept looking. And that meant, whoever it was, they were still hiding something. That afternoon, Helen took Halo and Shadow for a walk around the grounds. It had rained briefly after lunch, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. As they rounded the back garden, Shadow suddenly stopped, nose twitching, ears high. What is it, boy? He pulled toward the tool shed near the edge of the property. Helen followed, unhooking the latch and stepping inside. It smelled of soil and fertilizer, and a thin beam of sunlight pierced the gloom through a crack in the boards. She flicked on her flashlight and found a muddy pair of shoes stuffed under a shelf, men's loafers. Beside them, a crumpled towel with dark brown stains. At first glance, it could have been chocolate, but the darker patches, she didn't need to taste it to know. Blood. Back inside, Mike examined the shoes and towel while Helen stood nearby, arms crossed. They were hidden, not discarded, she said. Someone planned to come back for them. The shoes are size 10, Mike said. That narrows the guest list. Helen nodded. Chad's too small, Marlene's too old. The critic wears heels. That leaves the cousins, and maybe one of the male staff. I'll have the lab run tests. See if we can match the blood to Beatrice. Helen pointed to the sole. Check for chocolate traces, too. The pattern's consistent with the fountain base. Someone was there. Someone got messy. Then tried to clean up fast. Mike sighed. I hate to say it, but we're dealing with someone who knew what they were doing. Or someone who panicked afterward. Either way, the killer had left a trail, and Helen was determined to follow it, crumb by crumb. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Pantry. The kitchen had never felt so still. Helen stood alone by the long butcher block counter, staring at the neatly labeled shelves of herbs, spices, and specialty baking ingredients. Gone was the laughter of guests piping ganache, the clatter of bowls, the hum of mixers. It had all been replaced by silence, thick and uneasy, like an over-kneaded dough. Shadow sat at her feet, ears perked, watching her every move. Halo paced along the edge of the pantry, occasionally sniffing the doorframe as if he could smell the tension, or the secrets. And Helen was certain there were secrets. Earlier that morning, Mike had taken the blood-stained towel and shoes found in the shed to be analyzed. The preliminary lab report confirmed what they both suspected. The blood matched Beatrice Langford's. Someone had cleaned up, hastily, and had stashed the evidence for later. Whoever it was had made two critical errors: underestimating Shadow's nose and Helen's persistence. Now, she was determined to follow the trail, and it had led her right back here, to the pantry. Beatrice had always been meticulous. Every jar, tin, and box had a designated spot, alphabetized even. If something was missing or out of place, it would stand out, especially to Helen, who had a baker's trained eye. She stepped into the pantry and scanned the room. Flour on the left, sugars and syrups center, spices on the right. Shelf-labeled cocoa varieties looked untouched, aside from one gap between the Valrhona and the Ghirardelli. Strange. Helen ran her finger along the wooden shelf and caught a faint trail of powder. It was lighter than cocoa, softer, finer. Cornstarch. She frowned. That didn't belong here. The cornstarch container was kept near the thickeners across the pantry. She stepped over and opened the plastic tub labeled cornstarch. Empty? No, not empty. Swapped. The container was filled with a dark powder. Helen dipped a finger in, rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger, and sniffed. Bitter almond. Her stomach flipped. Shadow, she murmured. I think someone's been playing with poison. 15 minutes later, Sheriff Mike was at her side, peering into the container with a furrowed brow. Cyanide compound? He said, keeping his voice low. Smells like it. Bitter almond is a classic tell, Helen said, and I'm guessing someone replaced the real cornstarch to hide it. Mike picked up the container with gloved hands and sealed it in a plastic bag. We'll get this to the lab, but if it's what we think, this confirms it. Beatrice was poisoned before she went into the fountain. Helen nodded. Would explain the lack of struggle. She may have already been unconscious. Any idea how it got into her system? That chocolate fountain was running all night. Anyone could have slipped something in. Mike ran a hand over his face. I've got deputies checking food prep logs and security footage. We might get lucky. Helen's mind was already ahead. Whoever did this had access to the pantry, knew how to use poison, and needed Beatrice out of the way before the will was finalized. Emily mentioned Beatrice had been working late in her office the night before she died, Mike said. I'll have the safe checked again. If there's anything else hidden, we'll find it. Helen hesitated. There's another piece we're missing, the recipe journal. Mike gave her a look. The one you borrowed and didn't turn over to me? I gave you the red tin. Half credit. Helen smiled faintly. The journal had notes about people Beatrice didn't trust. I didn't read all of them. She might have documented past incidents with Teresa, or someone else entirely. Find it, Mike said. And Helen, be careful. Someone here is getting desperate. Later that afternoon, Helen sat in the parlor, pretending to read a cookbook while covertly watching the guests. Teresa was seated by the fireplace again, cool and composed, swirling wine in her glass like a villain in a soap opera. Margot Winter scribbled in a leather notebook, pausing occasionally to glance up, as if chronicling her surroundings. Chad was editing a video on his phone with one earbud in, while Delilah and Charlotte Langford bickered in whispers near the sideboard. Emily passed through briefly, speaking quietly with a deputy before retreating upstairs again, looking pale and drained. Everyone was on edge. Helen rose and made her way back to the kitchen. If the journal was still in Beatrice's office, she might be able to retrieve it before Mike's team went through every drawer. She slipped past the foyer and into the back hallway. Beatrice's office was locked, but Emily had left her a spare key the night before, just in case. Helen unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it quietly behind her. The room was dim and warm, heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood. A small lamp on the desk cast a soft glow across Beatrice's personal things: letters, cookbooks, framed photos of family members and famous bakers she'd known over the years. Helen moved to the desk and opened the bottom drawer. There it was, the recipe journal. She flipped through the pages quickly, stopping near the back where Beatrice's handwriting had grown smaller, more frantic. Teresa came again today, Asked too many questions about Emily. Wants to know what I plan to do with the inn. Margot visited last week. Thinks I owe her credit. She forgets the part she played in all this. Cousins keep circling like buzzards. I need to finish the new will, soon. Helen frowned. Beatrice had suspected everyone, and with good reason. A few pages later, she found a final note, dated 3 days before the murder. Saw Chad in the kitchen after hours. Said he needed a better lighting setup. I think he was filming something else. Must remember to check pantry. Helen blinked. Chad? She turned to go and stopped cold. Someone was at the door. A soft knock. Then the handle jiggled. She stepped back quickly, slipping the journal into her cardigan. The door opened. It was Marlene. Helen exhaled. Oh, sorry, Marlene said, startled. I didn't know anyone was in here. Just grabbing something for Mike, Helen said smoothly. Did you need something? Marlene hesitated, then stepped inside and closed the door gently. I wasn't sure who to talk to, but I think I saw something the night Beatrice died. Helen's eyebrows lifted. Go on. I couldn't sleep. I was in the library around 11:30. I saw Chad come downstairs in pajama pants, carrying something. A thermos, maybe? Then he went into the kitchen. Helen's pulse quickened. Did you see him come back out? No, I left a few minutes later, but it seemed odd. Why not just get a glass of water like everyone else? Helen nodded. Thank you, Marlene. That's helpful. She left the office and found Mike in the hallway. We need to talk about Chad. Chad Greenlee, influencer, content creator, and walking ego, was lounging on a chaise in the drawing room, eating from a bowl of chocolate-covered almonds. Mike approached with Helen at his side. Mr. Greenlee, mind coming with us? Chad blinked. Why? We have some questions. He followed them into the library, now cleared of guests. Mike gestured to a chair. We've heard you were in the kitchen the night Beatrice died. Chad shrugged. I was thirsty. I made cocoa. At 11:30? With what, pantry ingredients? I had a thermos, he said defensively. I like gourmet hot chocolate. Sue me. Mike folded his arms. Did you touch the chocolate fountain? No way. That thing was sacred. Beatrice would have killed me if I'd messed with it. Did you record anything that night? Chad hesitated. I set up a GoPro near the fountain for an overnight time-lapse. Was going to use it for a behind-the-scenes post. Helen and Mike exchanged a glance. Where is the footage? Helen asked. In my room. I haven't looked at it yet. Let's go, Mike said. Back in Chad's room, the GoPro sat on the windowsill. Mike plugged it into his tablet and fast-forwarded through hours of footage. At exactly 11:58 p.m., the lens caught someone entering the frame, shadowy, hooded, gloved. They approached the fountain, poured something in from a small bottle, then turned and walked out. The footage froze as the figure passed under a beam of moonlight. It wasn't Chad, and it wasn't Teresa. It was Charlotte Langford. Chapter 6, Whisked Away. Helen flipped open Chad's GoPro footage on Sheriff Mike's tablet, her heart thudding with anticipation. They fast-forwarded through hours of blurry night shots, candles flickering, chocolate gently cascading in the moonlight, shadows stretching and bending as the night wore on. Then, at 11:58 p.m., a movement in the lower right corner. Someone stepped into frame, hooded, their face hidden in shadow, silhouette nondescript. The person hovered near the chocolate fountain for less than 20 seconds, leaned forward, made a motion with their arm, and then slipped out of frame again, back into the darkness. The three of them stared at the paused frame in silence. Too dark to see who it is, Mike muttered. Could be male or female, Helen added. The coat looks long, maybe a trench. Could be Charlotte, could be Chad, could even be one of the kitchen staff. Chad crossed his arms. I told you I didn't touch the fountain. I just set up the camera for a time-lapse. Mike gave him a curt nod. You did the right thing giving us this footage. It's not proof yet, but it's a start. Helen leaned in. Did you notice anything else weird that night? Anything out of place? Chad shrugged. I mean, the pantry light was on when I went down. but I figured someone was just grabbing a snack. Was it still on when you left? He paused. Actually, no, it was off. I thought I turned it off. But now I'm not sure I went near it. Helen and Mike exchanged a look. Let's go check it, she said. The pantry was eerily still, the smell of cocoa and vanilla hanging in the air like a ghost. It had been cleaned since the murder, but Helen's eye still caught something odd, a dark stain in the grout near the baseboards, almost invisible against the shadowed wall. She crouched down, pulled a penlight from her coat pocket, and illuminated the spot. Mike, she said, you see this? He leaned down and looked. Could be chocolate. Could be something else. Helen reached for a napkin and dabbed it lightly against the grout. When she pulled it back, a dark, reddish-brown smear clung to the paper. Not chocolate, she said softly. Mike nodded grimly. We'll get it tested. As he sealed the napkin in a sample bag, Helen stepped back and scanned the room. Her eyes landed on the spice shelf. One tin was still turned slightly at an angle, bitter almond extract. Was this checked after the murder? She asked. Mike peered at it. Not specifically. We checked for swapped ingredients, but that wasn't flagged. Helen twisted the tin open and sniffed carefully. Bitter almond, she said. Strong, might be nothing. But if someone tampered with a batch, it could have come from here. Mike rubbed his jaw. They could have added it to something in the fountain, just enough to knock Beatrice out, then staged it as an accident. And the footage, Helen added, suggests someone did just that, but the identity's still hidden. Mike sighed. I'll assign someone to trace all pantry access, see who might have slipped in without being noticed. As they walked out, the kitchen door creaked open behind them. It was Emily. She looked pale, her eyes heavy with worry. Is something wrong? She asked. Helen nodded. We're getting closer. I think someone's been in my room, she said suddenly. Helen and Mike turned toward her. What happened? Helen asked. Emily pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. I left my door locked. When I came back from the parlor, it was unlocked. My things were moved. And this was folded and tucked into my suitcase. Helen took the note and read it. Stay quiet. Don't pretend you're safe here. No signature. Just a heavy, smeared fingerprint at the corner in what looked like cocoa powder, or ash. Mike's face darkened. We'll increase patrols. You'll have a deputy outside your door tonight. Helen's eyes narrowed. This isn't over. That evening, dinner was somber. The remaining guests gathered in the dining room, their conversations hushed, eyes flitting toward the empty head of the table, Beatrice's usual seat. A vase of fresh lilies stood in her place, a quiet tribute that seemed to hush even Chad's ever-ticking mouth. Helen picked at her lemon-glazed chicken while quietly observing the room. Delilah Langford ate quickly, her lips tight, like she had something to say, but wouldn't. Charlotte, her sister, avoided eye contact and sat unusually quiet. Teresa Mayweather sipped wine with the grace of a venomous cat, while Margot Winter took careful notes in her leather-bound journal. Marlene, sweet and fidgety, barely touched her plate. Someone in this room was lying. Someone knew exactly what had been poured into that fountain, and if the warning to Emily meant anything, they weren't finished. Later that night, Helen couldn't sleep. She sat in her rose-colored room, the dogs curled at her feet, her mind spinning. The footage, the extract, the bloodstain, and the note. Someone was trying to shut Emily up, or shake her enough to leave. That only made Helen more convinced Emily was central to the motive. The new will had changed everything, and whoever had the most to lose had reason to kill. She rose, wrapped her cardigan around her shoulders, and tiptoed downstairs with shadow and halo padding behind. The inn was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She decided to check Beatrice's office again. Something tugged at her intuition, like a forgotten clue waiting to be rediscovered. She opened the door gently and stopped. The office was a mess. Drawers yanked open, books off the shelves. The desk lamp was knocked over, its bulb flickering slightly. Someone had searched the room, and not carefully. She turned slowly, just as the office door slammed shut behind her. Helen lunged for it, but the handle didn't turn. Locked from the outside. She was trapped. Shadow growled. Halo began to bark. Helen backed away from the door, her mind racing. Someone had locked her in, and that meant they were trying to stop her from finding something, or stop her from leaving. She flicked on the desk lamp again and scanned the room. What were they looking for? She returned to the bookshelves. Several volumes had been pulled loose, but one, Cakes and Crimes, a culinary memoir, was wedged awkwardly sideways. Helen yanked it free. Behind it, tucked into a crevice in the wall, was a small manila envelope. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, a much younger Beatrice standing arm in arm with Simone Fournier, the famous French pastry chef. On the back, in faded ink, it read, "The recipe was always ours, but the truth belongs to Emily." Helen's heart jumped. Beatrice had been preparing for something bigger than a revised will. Suddenly she heard footsteps outside the door, and then silence. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then a soft click. The door creaked open. Mike stood in the hallway, flashlight in one hand, his expression sharp. "You weren't in your room," he said, "and the guard reported movement in this hallway." "I was locked in." "I know, we saw someone leaving, but they ran. Gone before we could catch them." Helen held up the photo. "They were looking for this." Mike took it, glanced at the back, and nodded. Beatrice was planning something big, maybe exposing someone, and it's all tied to Emily. Helen exhaled slowly. "Then we'd better keep Emily close." Chapter 7. A Bitter Aftertaste. Morning crept into Honeysuckle Inn like a reluctant apology. Outside the windows, the fog clung to the garden paths and orchard trees, wrapping the landscape in muted gray. Inside, the air was thicker with suspicion than steam from a fresh pot of coffee. Helen sat at the breakfast table, absent-mindedly buttering a scone she had no intention of eating. Shadow lay at her feet, ears twitching at every footstep. Halo sat alert beside her, his eyes trained on the parlor doorway as if waiting for someone, or something, to walk through it. The previous night still played on repeat in Helen's mind, locked in Beatrice's office, discovering the hidden photo, the phrase scrawled on the back. The recipe was always ours, but the truth belongs to Emily, and someone had tried to stop her from finding it. Only a handful of people knew where Helen was going that night, which meant the list of suspects was shrinking. Whoever had locked her in was desperate, likely the same person who'd searched Emily's room and planted the threatening note. Now that Charlotte and Delilah were under quiet surveillance, her suspicions shifted back to the less obvious characters, Teresa, Margot, and even Emily, though her instincts told her the young woman was more of a pawn in this game than a player. Margot strolled into the breakfast room, dressed immaculately as usual, her notebook in one hand and a perfectly buttered croissant in the other. "You look troubled, Helen," she said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Digestive issues? Or perhaps an unsolved murder weighing you down?" Helen gave her a thin smile. "I could ask you the same. That notebook getting heavier by the page?" Margot chuckled. "I write to remember, and to make sense of things. It's how I survived the Paris kitchens." Helen leaned forward. "You knew Simone Fournier, didn't you?" Margot blinked once. She was a competitor, brilliant, ambitious, arrogant. Why? "I found a photo of her with Beatrice, smiling, together." "Ah," Margot said, sitting back slightly. "Yes, before the falling out." "So there was a falling out?" Margot dabbed her lips with a napkin. Everyone knew about it, though few knew why. There were whispers that Beatrice accused Simone of stealing a recipe, or the other way around. I always assumed it was about more than food. Pride, ownership, legacy. "She left a note," Helen said carefully, watching Margot's expression. "Beatrice. She said the truth belongs to Emily." Now, Margot's poise cracked just for a second. A flicker of something, recognition, regret, passed through her eyes. "Perhaps she meant that the inheritance of this place comes with more than just furniture and frosting," Margot said. "Perhaps the truth was too bitter for Beatrice to finish on her own." Before Helen could press further, Mike entered, holding a manila folder. "Morning," he said briskly, nodding to both women. "Helen, can I see you in the hall?" In the quiet hallway, Mike handed her the folder. "Lab results are in. The bitter almond extract you found was laced with amygdalin." Helen flipped through the report. "Cyanide compound?" "Yep, same as the sample we pulled from the chocolate fountain." "So the poison was definitely added here, in the inn. Not brought in some imported ingredient." Mike nodded. "Whoever did this had access to the kitchen. That narrows it down to guests and staff." Helen closed the folder. "That narrows it to people who knew their way around a pastry kitchen." "Exactly. I just finished re-interviewing the staff. One of the kitchen assistants, Luis, said he saw Teresa in the pantry late the night of the murder." Helen frowned. What was her excuse? She claimed she needed a teaspoon of brandy to help her sleep. "Brandy? From the pantry?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "Exactly." Helen found Teresa outside on the veranda, seated with her legs crossed elegantly, nursing a cup of something steaming in a delicate china cup. "Teresa," Helen said, sitting across from her. "Brandy in the pantry? That's a new one." Teresa didn't flinch. "I don't recall needing your permission for my sleep rituals. You don't strike me as the type to rummage through dry goods for a nightcap." Teresa sipped delicately. "You're accusing me again." "I'm asking questions. You're the one filling in the blanks." Teresa's eyes narrowed. "Beatrice and I had history, yes, but I didn't kill her. And if you think I'd risk my career to knock off an old rival over an inn and a few lemon bars, then you haven't been paying attention." Helen pulled the recipe journal from her bag. "Beatrice wrote about you. Said you asked too many questions about Emily, about the will." "Of course I asked. I was surprised to see her here. The last time I saw Beatrice, she said she had no family left worth forgiving." "But she forgave Emily," Helen said, "and she changed everything." Teresa studied her for a moment, then exhaled. "She loved Emily, but didn't know how to say it. That's why she rewrote the will. I suspected it. I hated it. But I didn't kill her." "Then who did?" "I don't know, but if someone poisoned her, they did it in plain sight. And that means they're either smarter than us, or we're not looking closely enough." Back in her room, Helen laid out the suspects on paper, her handwriting looping and precise. Emily Langford inherited everything. Possibly unaware, feels genuinely shaken. Teresa Mayweather, resentful of Beatrice, found in the pantry, but smart, cautious. Margot Winter, knows the history, possibly knew about the changed will, emotionally distant. Charlotte and Delilah Langford, financial motives, aggressive, but maybe too obvious. Chad Greenlee, filming everything, caught shadowy footage, but doesn't seem to understand the gravity of what's going on. And finally, Marlene Fielding, quiet, nervous, no obvious motive, or so it seems. Helen circled Marlene's name. She didn't want to suspect her, but Marlene was always around, always overhearing, always moving quietly from room to room. What if she wasn't as timid as she seemed? Shadow let out a soft growl, breaking her train of thought. A knock sounded at the door. Emily. "I think I found something," she said. Helen stood aside to let her in. "What is it?" Emily held out a tattered letter. "It was wedged behind a drawer in Beatrice's room. I was putting away laundry and the bottom fell out." Helen unfolded the letter. It was in Beatrice's handwriting, dated 6 months ago. "Margot knows. I saw her with the ledger. If she tells Simone's family what we did, I don't know how long I can keep pretending. I'm tired of carrying the blame. She said if I go public, she'll ruin me." Helen's heart stopped. Margot knew, and she'd used it. "Emily," Helen said slowly, "I think this changes everything." That night, Helen met Mike on the porch again, the fog thick around them like a co-conspirator. "She blackmailed her," Helen said. "Margot knew about whatever Simone and Beatrice did together, maybe stealing a recipe, maybe co-authoring something and hiding the truth. She used that knowledge to control her." "And now Beatrice is dead," Mike said. "You think Margot killed her to keep her quiet?" "I think Margot feared Beatrice was going to confess something, and Emily inheriting the inn might give her the platform to do it." Mike sighed. "We need Margot's full story." "I'll get it," Helen said, "but I have to do it my way." Mike gave her a wary look. "I don't like the sound of that." Helen smiled. "Then don't listen." Chapter 8. Crumbs of Truth. Helen had always believed that people, like pastries, eventually revealed their true centers. Some cracked under heat, some held up to pressure, and others, those most dangerous, looked perfectly composed on the outside but were full of something rotten. And Margot Winter, with her polished boots and tightly wound manners, was starting to smell like trouble. As the guests milled about the drawing room, chatting softly over a lukewarm tea service, Helen took her time. She observed from a distance, watched every gesture. Margot spoke with precision, like a woman who edited her thoughts before they even reached her mouth. She laughed politely, smiled thinly, but her eyes always scanned the room, calculating. Mike had taken a cautious approach. He wanted to wait for a search warrant and gather more evidence before confronting Margot. But Helen couldn't sit idle. Beatrice hadn't asked her to be careful. She'd asked her to find the truth. And so Helen set a little trap. It began with a note. Scribbled in her signature looping cursive, Helen slipped it under Margot's door late that afternoon. "You were right. Beatrice wrote everything down. She hid it where she used to write her thank you notes. You'll want to get it before someone else does." She signed it with a false initial. T. Teresa, naturally. Helen didn't know whether the bait would work. But Beatrice had kept a small drawer in the writing desk near the garden room, where she stored stationery and handwritten notes. It was the kind of hiding place someone nostalgic might choose. And if Margot was desperate to cover her tracks... Helen waited in the shadows across the hall. At exactly 5:42 p.m., Margot emerged from her room and walked briskly past the breakfast nook, down the hall, and into the writing room. She moved quickly, but not hurriedly, like a woman who knew she didn't want to be seen, but wouldn't dare admit it. Shadow let out a low whine beside Helen's legs. "I know, boy," she whispered. "Let's see what she's looking for." 10 minutes passed, then 15. Helen edged closer to the doorway. Inside, Margot stood with the small drawer open, her gloved hands rifling through envelopes. She paused, pulled one out, and unfolded a single sheet of paper. And froze. Helen stepped inside. "I hoped you'd come looking," she said. Margot whirled around, startled, the paper still in her hand. "What is the meaning of this?" "I figured if Beatrice left behind something important, you wouldn't be able to resist destroying it." Margot's eyes narrowed. "You set me up." "You walked in willingly," Helen said, stepping closer. "What's on the page?" Margot hesitated, then tossed it on the desk. Helen picked it up. It was a recipe. But not just any recipe. It was Simone Fournier's signature almond tart, handwritten in Beatrice's cursive, but signed at the bottom, co-created with Simone. Finalized at Honeysuckle Inn, spring 2005, proof. This would destroy Simone's image, Margot said. If the culinary world knew her most iconic dessert wasn't hers alone, her reputation, her legacy, all of it would burn. "And you've been sitting on that truth for how long?" Margot's face twitched. "Since the conference in 2006. I confronted Beatrice back then. Told her if she ever tried to claim credit, I'd expose everything. How they hid their collaboration, how they both profited from it behind the scenes. I had the original recipe journal. Beatrice begged me to give her time. But she never told Emily, never corrected the record." "She was trying," Helen said quietly. "I think she wanted to make peace with more than just Emily." Margot gave a bitter laugh. "There's no peace in the culinary world, Helen. Only leverage. The right recipe in the wrong hands can ruin careers." "And so you tried to stop her?" Margot looked at her evenly. "I'm many things, but I'm not a murderer." Later that evening, Helen met Mike on the front porch as thunderclouds began to gather over the trees. "She admitted to blackmail," Helen said. "Held that tart recipe over Beatrice's head for nearly 2 decades. But I believe her. She didn't kill her." Even blackmailers draw the line somewhere, Mike said. But the timing still stinks. I know, but something doesn't add up. Everyone we've suspected so far had reason, but they're too obvious. Mike pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Well, here's something less obvious. Helen opened it. It was a background check on Marlene Fielding. No way, she whispered. Mike nodded grimly. Real name's not Marlene. It's Martha Fielder, former sous chef at a resort in Aspen, fired quietly after a guest reported a food allergy scare involving bitter almond. She changed her name? New start, moved around, no charges stuck, but a pattern of job changes and a few harassment claims. Helen stared at the paper. She's been quiet, sweet, but she's always there. And she has the experience to use a compound like amygdalin without raising flags. Helen paced. We need to talk to her, carefully. But Marlene wasn't in her room, and she wasn't in the kitchen, or the garden, or anywhere on the first floor. Shadow and Halo sniffed their way around the inn, but paused near the back staircase, the narrow, lesser-used one that led to the attic level. Helen and Mike exchanged a look. They climbed together. The attic door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was stifling, dry, dusty, and perfumed with old cedar and lavender sachets. The dim light from a single bulb cast long shadows across the storage trunks and shelves of retired decor. And in the center, seated calmly in a rocking chair, was Marlene. She looked up, her expression oddly peaceful. You figured it out, didn't you? She said softly. Helen nodded. Why, Marlene? Marlene smiled. She took everything from me. Helen blinked. Beatrice? Marlene's voice cracked. Simone, Beatrice, both of them. I was there in Paris, part of the original recipe testing. I suggested the almond base, the lemon zest, the cinnamon-dusted crust, mine. But did they credit me? No. I was just the help, the assistant. You were part of that tart's creation. I was the backbone of it. They laughed when I asked for acknowledgement, said thank you and moved on. When I saw Beatrice hosting this retreat, when I heard Emily was coming to claim her share, I snapped. Helen's throat tightened. So you took the extract. Marlene's eyes glazed over. I didn't want her dead, just sick, just rattled. I spiked the chocolate base with a few drops of bitter almond, but I didn't realize how pure it was. She must have had a reaction immediately. I didn't know she had a heart condition. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't. Marlene flinched. Then I killed her. Mike stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. Marlene Fielding, I'm placing you under arrest for the poisoning death of Beatrice Langford. She didn't resist. As they led her down the stairs, the storm broke overhead. Thunder rumbled like distant drums, and rain fell softly against the stained glass windows of the inn. The next morning was quiet. Emily sat in the sunroom with Halo's head in her lap and Shadow asleep beside her feet. She confessed? She asked Helen. Helen nodded. She thought Beatrice had erased her legacy, but Beatrice didn't even know she was here. Emily exhaled slowly. This place, it's full of ghosts. Helen smiled gently, and memories, and second chances. Emily looked up. Will you come back for the holiday retreat? Only if you promise not to poison the eggnog. They both laughed. Chapter 9. A Recipe for Deception. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the grounds of Honeysuckle Inn glistening with dew and silence. From the outside, everything looked peaceful. Roses blooming, bees humming lazily around the lavender beds, the garden arch draped in early ivy. But inside Helen Lighthall's chest, there was a rumble of doubt that wouldn't quiet. Marlene Fielding had confessed. She'd admitted to poisoning the chocolate fountain with bitter almond extract, believing it would simply make Beatrice ill, not kill her. Sheriff Mike had her in custody, and the local paper was already calling Helen the amateur sleuth of Sugar Hill County. But the deeper Helen thought about it, the more uneasy she felt. Marlene wasn't the kind of person who made mistakes with ingredients. Her background showed training, precision, years in high-end kitchens. And if the compound she used had been that potent, then even a tiny error would have made the difference between discomfort and death. So what if Marlene hadn't made a mistake? What if she hadn't been working alone? Helen found Emily in the kitchen that morning, attempting to frost a small lemon cake. The scene was oddly heartwarming. Emily in an apron too big for her, Halo at her feet hoping for crumbs, and Shadow curled near the stove, snoring softly. "How's the cake?" Helen asked gently. Emily smiled, though her eyes were tired. "Too much zest, not enough patience." "I used to make that mistake," Helen said. "Thought if a little lemon was good, then a lot would be better. It doesn't work that way with citrus, or with people." Emily paused, the icing knife hovering mid-swipe. "Do you think I pushed her too hard? That she changed the will because I came back?" "I think Beatrice knew what she was doing, but she also knew someone wouldn't be happy about it." Helen hesitated. "Emily, did Marlene ever say anything unusual to you? Or about your aunt?" Emily shook her head. "Not really. She kept to herself. Always offered to help with dishes or set the table. She seemed harmless." "That's what worries me." Helen stepped closer. "There's something off about her confession. The dosage, the method, the motive, it's just too neat. Beatrice was deliberate, and someone else, someone with more to lose, might have nudged things along without Marlene even knowing." Emily set down the knife. "You mean someone used her?" Helen nodded. "It's a theory, but if it's true, we need to figure out who." Helen's next stop was Beatrice's office, now quieter, more still, but no less haunted. She opened the desk drawers again, this time taking her time, checking for anything that might have been overlooked. She found a sealed envelope marked, "For Emily, only if something happens to me." Inside was a short note. "Dearest Emily, if you're reading this, I didn't get the chance to say what I wanted. I'm sorry for how long it took me to forgive myself and to find you again. There are people who will try to take this place from you with smiles and promises. Don't let them. The key is in the pantry, the one I told you never to touch. Love always, B-star." Helen reread the last line twice. The key is in the pantry, not metaphorical, literal. She tucked the note into her pocket and headed straight to the pantry. The pantry was the same, orderly, fragrant, and deceivingly ordinary. Helen stood in the doorway for a long moment, then crossed to the back wall, where Beatrice had always kept a wooden crate marked, "Holiday Spices, do not open until December." Helen opened the crate. At first, it was just tins of cloves, nutmeg, and cardamom, wrapped in wax paper. But at the bottom, nestled beneath a cloth napkin, was a small red tin box. Inside it was a key and a small slip of paper. Recipe box, lavender room closet, bottom drawer. Helen didn't waste a second. The lavender room was 2 doors down from the rose room where Helen had been staying. It was one of the guest rooms Beatrice rarely used, mostly because she said it was too purple for polite company. The room smelled faintly of perfume and old wood. Helen opened the closet, pulled out the bottom drawer, and found a wooden recipe box carved with delicate flower vines. Inside the box were several index cards and a small black notebook. The index cards were all dated from 2003 to 2005 and labeled Test Kitchen Collaboration Project. Recipes were written in 2 sets of handwriting, Beatrice's and someone else's. Based on the flourishes, it looked like Simone Fournier's. The black notebook, however, was even more interesting. It was a ledger, Beatrice's personal ledger. Inside, Helen found lists of purchases, baking class payments, vendor invoices, and tucked in the middle, stapled between 2 pages, was a receipt. From just 6 weeks ago. To Margot Winter, from Beatrice Langford. $3,000. Reimbursement for original tart source agreement. Helen's breath caught. She scanned the entries before and after. Payments to suppliers, entries for baking tools, regular bills, and then this one lump sum to Margot. Blackmail money. And even more curious, a note next to the payment that read, "Final installment. Truth will follow." It wasn't a suicide note. It was a statement of intent. Beatrice had planned to go public, but someone couldn't afford to let her. Helen showed the notebook to Mike in his office just after lunch. He flipped through the entries silently, then looked up at her. So Marlene wasn't working alone. Helen nodded. Someone manipulated her, maybe convinced her to act, maybe even adjusted the dosage. But whoever it was, they were scared Beatrice would expose them. And Margot? She has motive, blackmail history, and the most to lose if the truth came out. But not access to the pantry during the critical time, Mike said. Staff say Margot never entered the kitchen after 9 p.m. that night. Helen frowned. What if she didn't need to? What if she coached someone else into doing it? Mike raised an eyebrow. Emily? Helen shook her head. Too close to Beatrice. Too genuine. But maybe someone else. Someone who knew how to manipulate guilt. Later that day, Helen found Margot in the garden, snipping dead rose heads into a wicker basket. You knew about the ledger, didn't you? Helen asked. Margot didn't look up. I suspected she kept records. Beatrice was always tidy with her messes. You took money from her. Now Margot's expression changed, just slightly. Her lips pressed together. Her posture stiffened. You made her pay to keep quiet about the tart, but when she planned to confess anyway, when she gave Emily everything, you decided to end it. Margot laughed once, short and bitter. I may be ruthless, Helen, but I'm not sloppy. And poisoning a public dessert display? That's desperate. Helen stepped closer. Unless you didn't poison it. You let someone else do it. Someone who thought they were finally proving themselves. Someone you'd whispered to, supported, comforted. Margot's smile faded. You think I used Marlene? I think you recruited her, fed her just enough of the truth to twist it, told her she was forgotten, told her Beatrice would never make things right. Margot dropped the clippers into the basket. If you have proof, call Mike. I don't need proof, Helen said. I just needed to see your face when I said it. That night, Helen and Mike met one last time in the sunroom. She's not going to confess, Mike said, arms folded. But the ledger is damning. So are the handwritten recipes. Beatrice was building a case against Margot, and Margot knew it. Mike exhaled. We'll pressure her, quietly. If she encouraged Marlene to act, that still makes her culpable. Helen sat back in the armchair, Halo's head resting on her slippered foot. You know, she said, every time I think I've found the last layer of this mystery, there's another crust to crack. Like a millefeuille of motives. Helen laughed softly. Exactly. Outside, the garden lamps flickered on, one by one. Inside, the inn slowly exhaled its grief. And somewhere, Helen felt, Beatrice Langford was smiling. Chapter 10. Caught with a cookie sheet. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the kind of spring day that pretended it was summer until you stepped outside and promptly regretted your wardrobe choices. Helen stood on the veranda of Honeysuckle Inn with a steaming mug of Earl Grey, watching the sunlight spill across the garden paths like melted gold. But even as the grounds glistened and the breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and rosemary, the air still pulsed with something uneasy. The killer had been caught. Marlene was in jail. The motive was on paper. And yet, the pieces didn't fit together neatly. Marlene was precise, yet the dosage she administered had been too high. Beatrice had enemies, but none of them had been formally charged. Margot had motive and leverage, but not direct evidence tying her to the murder. And now Margot was moving quietly, carefully, like someone preparing for a retreat rather than a confrontation. Inside, the inn had resumed its slow rhythm. Guests who remained were either waiting for interviews with Mike or too polite to leave during a scandal. Emily had been busy organizing Beatrice's paperwork, scanning old documents, and answering phone calls from extended family members who had, suddenly, remembered she existed. Helen helped when she could, offering lemon scones and company, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her eyes kept drifting to Margot Winter, always poised, always controlled. But Helen had been watching closely, and something had changed. Margot had become more distracted, her sentences shorter, her once unshakable calm now showing hairline fractures. And that's when Helen had an idea. She waited until mid-afternoon, when most of the guests had wandered outside for fresh air and sunlight. Margot was seated in the parlor, as always, notebook in hand, sipping a perfectly made cappuccino. Helen approached casually, shadow at her heels. "I've been thinking," Helen said, "about how Beatrice handled secrets. She wasn't perfect, but she was fair." Margot looked up, one brow arched. Fairness is a subjective measure. Maybe, but Beatrice always believed people deserved second chances. "Unless she held a grudge," Margot replied, flipping a page. "Then she held it like a piping bag, tight and high until it burst." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of piping bags, I came across something odd in the kitchen inventory. A whole box of them went missing the day before she died." Margot's hand paused over her notebook. "Oh, it's probably nothing," Helen said breezily. "Still, when one of those goes missing and then shows up later in the trash with residue that isn't icing, well, Mike gets curious." Margot's lips tightened just a little. "And even stranger," Helen added, "there was a powdered residue on a second one that matched the pantry's bitter almond compound." Now Margot's eyes narrowed. "Is this an interrogation, Helen?" "No," Helen said, smiling sweetly. "This is me giving you a chance to tell your side of the story, before the lab finishes testing that piping bag." Margot stood, slow and deliberate. "Careful, Helen. You're playing with fire. Accusing people without proof can get you sued." Helen rose too, matching her tone. "And poisoning someone to protect a secret can get you life in prison." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Margot turned and walked out of the room without another word. Helen found Mike in the front hallway, reviewing notes with one of the deputies. "She's cracking," she whispered to him. "I mentioned the piping bag we found and her whole demeanor changed. She knows we're closing in." Mike nodded. "Toxicology from the bag should be in later today. If it matches the poison, we'll have enough to arrest her." "But she knows that," Helen said. "She won't wait around. She'd have to be stupid to run. She's desperate, not stupid." Mike folded his arms. "Then we make her act first." That evening, Helen staged a little show. She sat in the garden with a tray of cookies, a fresh journal, and a pot of herbal tea, just visible from the parlor windows. She smiled at guests, waved to passing staff, and made sure Margot saw her drop the recipe box onto the bench beside her. Inside the box was a bundle of handwritten index cards tied with twine. Not the originals. Helen had those hidden in her suitcase, but very convincing fakes, copied in the same cursive. Each card was labeled Confession, Ledger, or Simone's Original. It was bait, a recipe for deception, and Margot, if she was watching, had just caught the scent. Helen left the tray on the bench as dusk fell, taking Shadow and Halo inside for their dinner. She asked Mike to keep an eye on the garden from the security feed while she pretended to be preoccupied with lemon bars in the kitchen. Sure enough, less than 30 minutes later, Margot slipped outside. She looked both ways before sitting on the bench. She opened the recipe box and began rifling through the index cards, and that's when Mike stepped outside. "You looking for something, Ms. Winter?" he asked, voice casual. Margot froze, then looked up slowly, her face blank. "These were left outside unattended. Anyone could have taken them." "And yet, here you are," Mike said. "Going through private documents." She stood. "I thought they belonged to Emily. I was returning them." Mike crossed the garden slowly. "We got the tox report. That piping bag? Same compound used to poison Beatrice." Margot's expression didn't flicker. "And your fingerprints are on the outside of it," he added. Helen stepped out from behind the hedge. "We found traces of the extract in your room, too, on a spoon in your travel bag." Margot gave a thin, bitter smile. "You staged this." "We learned from the best," Helen replied. Margot sighed, sitting back down. "You're clever, Helen. I'll give you that." "So you admit it?" "I didn't kill her," Margot said softly. "Marlene did. I just gave her a nudge." Helen felt her stomach turn. "You manipulated her." "She was already angry, already drowning in resentment. All I did was point out the injustice. Beatrice never even said thank you to her, not once. Marlene just needed to believe she mattered, that she'd finally be seen. "You supplied the extract," Mike said. "You knew how dangerous it was." "I told her to use just a few drops, enough to give Beatrice a scare. That was it. But Marlene didn't measure. She poured." Helen folded her arms. "And you walked away with clean hands." Margot looked down at the fake index card still in her lap. "Not clean, just untraceable. Until now." Mike arrested her that night. Not for murder, for conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction, and tampering with evidence. The lab reports, along with Margot's own words on tape, gave them enough to hold her. The DA would sort out the rest. Marlene, when told of the truth, was devastated. She wept during the second interrogation and asked to write a letter to Emily. Mike allowed it. The story, as complicated as it had been, finally had its final page. Helen sat on the back porch of the inn the next morning, watching shadow roll lazily in the sun while Halo chased a butterfly through the garden. Emily joined her with 2 mugs of coffee. "You're leaving tomorrow?" she asked. Helen nodded. "Back to Maplewood. I promised my garden it wouldn't go neglected." Emily sipped her drink. "I've been thinking about turning the retreat into a yearly thing, smaller, more focused, maybe a little mystery-themed class." "I'd come to that," Helen said with a smile. "You're good at this. You ever think about doing it professionally?" "I thought I was," Helen teased. "Pastry sleuth, dog wrangler, detective of desserts." They laughed. Then Emily reached into her pocket and handed Helen a small card. It was one of Beatrice's original index cards, yellowed slightly, with a faded ink smudge in the corner. "To Helen, for your courage, your kindness, and your clever tongue. Thank you for finding the truth. Love, B." Helen blinked quickly, brushing a tear from the corner of her eye. "She left that for you," Emily said, "in her recipe box. Said she knew you'd earn it." Helen stood, folding the card into her pocket. "I think I'll frame it, right next to my first burned batch of croissants. A reminder that life is messy, but it's still worth baking through." Chapter 11. The Icing on the Case. The scent of lemon and sugar wafted through Honeysuckle Inn like a whisper of something sweet and new. It had been 3 days since Margot's arrest, and yet the place still felt suspended in time, caught between mourning and healing. Outside, late spring blooms brightened the hedges, but inside, the air carried the weight of truths finally unburied. Helen stood at the kitchen counter, kneading a soft dough for scones, while Emily whisked cream by the window. Halo and Shadow were both dozing by the open screen door, letting the sun warm their coats. "So what now?" Emily asked, her voice thoughtful. "About Margot? About all of it?" Helen pressed her thumb into the dough, turning it out gently. "The DA is building the case. She'll be charged with conspiracy, reckless endangerment, obstruction, and possibly accessory to manslaughter. Depends on how Marlene's charges shake out." "Do you think Margot planned it all from the beginning?" Helen paused, considering. "Not all, but enough. She saw an opportunity. Marlene's resentment, Beatrice's guilt, your inheritance, and she used it. That kind of manipulation isn't something you do by accident. It's practiced." Emily folded her arms. "It's so cold." "Calculated," Helen agreed. She convinced Marlene she was righting a wrong, that hurting Beatrice would make things better, but all she really wanted was to keep Beatrice quiet and protect her own secrets. Emily's eyes drifted to the back garden. "She almost got away with it." "But she didn't." Helen smiled gently. "Because Beatrice was smarter. She left a trail, and you trusted your instincts when it mattered." Emily chuckled. "I was mostly just trying not to cry in front of guests." Grief and grit go hand in hand. Later that morning, Sheriff Mike stopped by the inn one final time, his boots still muddy from the county road and his jacket dusted with pollen. He stood at the kitchen threshold like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. Helen poured him a cup of coffee before he could speak. "Report?" she asked with a teasing grin. He accepted the cup gratefully. "Marlene agreed to a full written confession. Says she wants to make amends to Emily. She's also offering to testify against Margot." Will it hold up? It will. Mike sipped and sighed. Between her confession, the toxicology, the ledger, and the audio from the garden, the case is airtight. Margot's attorney is already asking for a deal. Good, Helen said. The damage is done, but the truth matters. He looked at her then, with an expression that was equal parts admiration and amusement. You always do this. Turn something messy into something resolved. Helen wiped her hands on a towel. That's what bakers do. We take chaos, flour, eggs, fire, and make it something good. Still, he said, I wish you'd reconsider coming on board. You'd make a better detective than half my department. I have enough mysteries in my kitchen, thank you. The rest of the day passed quietly. Guests began checking out with warm handshakes and reluctant goodbyes. The air inside the inn softened, less tension, more laughter. The shadows had lifted. By late afternoon, Helen sat in the sunroom alone, flipping through one of Beatrice's recipe books. Not the ledger, not the journal, but a worn, cheerful binder filled with handwritten cards, flower fingerprints, and random doodles. On the inside cover, in Beatrice's handwriting, it read, Bake bravely, love wildly, forgive often, and never, ever skip dessert. Helen smiled. She closed the book and leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet wrap around her like a warm apron. That evening, the inn staff and a few remaining guests gathered in the dining room for a small remembrance dinner in Beatrice's honor. Emily stood at the head of the table, wearing one of her aunt's vintage aprons and holding a glass of sparkling cider. I wasn't here for the last decade of Beatrice's life, she said, and I'll always regret that. But I was here for the last days, and I saw her smile. I saw her laugh, and I saw the love she had for this place, for all of you. That's what I'll hold on to. Glasses clinked. Someone sniffled. And I have one more surprise, Emily added. Helen has agreed to share Beatrice's lemon bar recipe. She's made a batch using the original instructions, which, I'm told, require swearing at the oven at least once. Laughter filled the room. Helen stood, bashfully, and placed a tray at the center of the table. Each lemon bar was cut with precision, the crust golden and the filling bright, dusted with just the right amount of powdered sugar. These are made, Helen said softly, not with justice or revenge, but with gratitude, for Beatrice, for second chances, and for all the little things that make life sweet. They toasted again, this time in silence. After dessert, as guests retired to their rooms and the staff cleared the dishes, Helen wandered into the garden one last time. The moon was full, the breeze soft. Fireflies blinked lazily across the hedges. She found Emily sitting by the fountain, halo at her feet and shadow curled by the base. Thank you, Emily said, not looking up, for everything. Helen sat beside her. Your aunt was proud of you. She may not have said it, but she showed it in every decision she made. I'm still scared. That's how you know it matters. They sat together for a while, letting the silence settle like flour on a counter. Finally, Emily turned. Do you think she knew how it would end? Helen shook her head. I think she hoped it wouldn't, but she planned in case it did. That's the sign of someone brave. Emily nodded. So what happens now? You live, you bake, you forgive, and you make this place better than ever. Emily smiled. I'm thinking of renaming the retreat. The Lemon Bar Legacy. I'd come to that, Helen said, especially if there's tea. Back in her room, Helen packed her small suitcase, folded the apron Beatrice had left her, and placed the thank you note beside it. She ran her hand along the dresser's edge and smiled. In the morning, she would head back to Maplewood, back to her cozy cottage, her garden, her dogs. But something in her had changed, something quiet but undeniable. This wasn't just about solving crimes or baking desserts. It was about seeing people, really seeing them, and helping them find their place in the world again. She closed her suitcase, turned off the lamp, and whispered to the shadows, Good night, Bee. We did it. Chapter 12. The bake-off and goodbye. The morning sun crept through gauzy curtains, casting dappled patterns across the floral wallpaper of Helen's room. The scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and Halo stirred from the foot of the bed with a soft grunt. Shadow, already alert, padded silently to the window and watched the birds flutter through the honeysuckle trellis. It was Helen's last day at the inn. The thought brought a strange weight, part relief, part melancholy. Though she'd only been there a week, the inn had settled into her like a favorite sweater, warm, familiar, a little worn, but rich with meaning. She moved through the morning quietly, packed her things, fed the dogs, slipped downstairs to find Emily already busy in the kitchen, humming softly as she sifted flour into a large ceramic bowl. "Morning," Emily said, glancing up with a smile. "Is that your third batch of scones this week?" "Practice makes better." She held up a sticky note. "Found this on Aunt Bee's bulletin board. Bake-Off Saturday. Winner gets bragging rights and my cinnamon recipe. Thought we'd go through with it." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting a contest?" "I'm suggesting closure. With cinnamon." Emily grinned. "It's only fair you compete before you leave." Helen folded her arms. "You're going to make me earn my exit, aren't you?" "Absolutely, it's what Aunt Bee would have wanted." By mid-morning, word of the impromptu bake-off had spread. Remaining staff, a few guests, and even Mike, who just happened to swing by in uniform, gathered in the garden courtyard. A folding table was set up with 2 mixing stations, fresh ingredients, and 2 apron hooks. Helen's was already occupied by her familiar floral apron. Emily's bore a brand new patch with head baker in training, stitched in golden thread. "You set me up," Helen muttered as she tied her apron. "Only a little." Emily pulled her hair back. "Loser does the dishes. You're on." The rules were simple. 60 minutes. Create a baked good using the theme ingredient, cinnamon. Taste, texture, and creativity would be judged by a 3-person panel: Mike, Marlene's replacement in the kitchen staff, and the inn's oldest guest, Mrs. Delacroix, who claimed she had survived 3 wars and 5 husbands, none of whom could bake worth a damn. Helen grinned as she prepped her ingredients. The challenge was just what she needed: not a crime to solve, not a trail of lies to unravel, but a simple, old-fashioned kitchen showdown. She decided on cinnamon pear galettes, rustic and flaky with just the right blend of warmth and sweetness. Emily leaned toward classic cinnamon rolls, using a sourdough starter Beatrice had nurtured for nearly a decade, the courtyard filled with the scent of butter, spice, and quiet laughter. Helen watched Emily knead her dough and couldn't help but feel proud. The girl had come a long way in such a short time. She was steadier now, confident in a way that came not from arrogance, but from clarity. As the bake-off continued, guests sipped lemonade, cheered when Mike accidentally floured his shoes, and offered unsolicited advice that was cheerfully ignored. Shadow and Halo took their roles seriously as honorary judges, occasionally sneaking scraps from the edges of dropped batter. When the timer buzzed, Helen and Emily placed their finished creations on the table and stepped back. The judges made a show of sniffing, tasting, and murmuring among themselves. Helen's galettes were praised for their balanced spice and delicate crust. Emily's cinnamon rolls earned points for their fluffy centers and orange zest glaze. Finally, after a dramatic pause longer than necessary, Mrs. Delacroix stood and raised her fork like a scepter. "We've reached a verdict," she announced, "and by the power vested in me by age, appetite, and a stubborn palate, I declare a tie." Laughter erupted around the courtyard. Helen turned to Emily. "I'm guessing your bribe didn't work?" "Not even a little." The 2 women hugged, and for a long moment, nothing else mattered, just the sun, the smells, the flour on their aprons, and the warmth of a good ending. That afternoon, Helen loaded her suitcase into the trunk of her car. Shadow and Halo had already claimed the back seat, tails wagging and tongues lolling in anticipation of the ride. Emily walked her out, a box tucked under her arm. "What's this?" Helen asked. Emily handed it over. "The last of Aunt Bee's lemon preserves, and the original cinnamon roll recipe. She wanted you to have it." Helen swallowed the lump in her throat. You sure? She always said recipes were meant to be shared, and I think you'll do something special with it. Helen smiled, holding the box close. I'll guard it with my life. She climbed into the car, adjusted the rearview mirror, and started the engine. As she backed out of the gravel drive, Emily waved, framed by the trellis arch. The inn stood behind her, golden and proud beneath the spring sun, and in the back garden, bees drifted lazily between blooms as though nothing had ever gone wrong. But it had, and they had made it through anyway. On the road, Helen drove in peaceful silence for miles, letting the scenery blur past in a quilt of green fields and soft clouds. Eventually, she pulled off onto a quiet overlook, letting the dogs out for a stretch. She sat on a bench with a thermos of tea and opened the cinnamon roll recipe. At the bottom of the card, in Beatrice's looping handwriting, was a final note. Dear Helen, if you're reading this, it means you found the truth, and maybe yourself too. Keep baking, keep looking. The world will always need someone who can see what others don't, and don't forget the cinnamon. Helen smiled and let the wind carry the scent of tea and memory into the distance. She still didn't know where the road would take her next, but she was ready. Epilogue: Trouble at Foxglove Fair. 3 weeks after her eventful stay at Honeysuckle Inn, Helen Lighthall stood beneath a fluttering white tent at the Foxglove County Fairgrounds, trying to decide if the pie she was judging had used too much cornstarch, or if her standards had become impossible to satisfy. Behind her, the sound of a brass band competed with the cries of children chasing cotton candy, while the aroma of fried dough, grilled corn, and fresh-cut flowers blended into a heady perfume. Summer had arrived early, or so the fair organizers claimed, and Foxglove Fair was in full bloom. Helen adjusted her floppy straw hat, dipped her fork into a suspicious-looking pecan pie, and smiled politely at the baker waiting just outside the rope line. Halo and Shadow lounged nearby under the judging table, both wearing honorary fair judge ribbons, because someone at registration had a sense of humor. Well, she said, setting her fork down, the crust is flaky, but the filling's a bit stiff. Excellent nut-to-syrup ratio, though. The baker, a portly man with a bow tie and a dusting of flour on his shoes, nodded solemnly. My grandmother swore by gelatin. I'm sure she did, Helen said kindly. But the judges agreed. Nothing should jiggle quite that much unless it's dancing. The man grinned and moved on, leaving Helen with her clipboard and the next pie, a towering lattice-topped cherry number with sugared edges and a slightly uneven shape that made her heart warm. Amateurs always had more passion. And more secrets. She took a bite and let the tartness coat her tongue. Just enough sweetness, she thought. Bold cherry, hints of almond, but not overpowering. A ribbon-worthy entry, if she'd ever tasted one. She jotted a few notes, nodded at the wide-eyed teenager who baked it, and stood to stretch her legs. A breeze danced across the fairgrounds, lifting tent flaps and rustling the prize ribbons strung along the fence. The dogs trotted beside her as she walked, their ears perked, their noses twitching with excitement. All around her, the fair buzzed. Toddlers screamed on miniature rides, couples strolled with lemonade, and farmers boasted about the size of their heirloom zucchinis. It was lovely. Idyllic. Too idyllic. Which, in Helen's experience, usually meant something was about to go wrong. She didn't have to wait long. As she returned to the judging tent, a commotion was brewing near the produce competition tables. Voices rose, tense and fast, and by the time Helen arrived, a small crowd had formed. In the center stood an older woman in a navy floral dress, her arms folded tightly. Beside her, a tall man in overalls held a bushel of disqualified tomatoes. Now I know those tomatoes didn't sprout wings and fly into someone else's crate, he said, face flushed. And I'm telling you, the woman snapped, those are not the heirlooms I entered. Mine were striped. Those are solid red and far too uniform. Helen slipped into the edge of the circle and listened. A third person, one of the fair's produce judges, stood awkwardly between them, holding a clipboard and trying to mediate. Mrs. Thistlewhite insists these are not her tomatoes, he said, but Mr. Porter swears he picked them himself yesterday. There's no tag, and, well, Someone moved the crates. Switch tags? Helen asked, stepping forward. The judge looked relieved. Ms. Lighthall, yes, you're a special guest. Maybe you could take a look. Helen crouched and studied the tomatoes. Uniform, almost suspiciously so, and tucked beneath one of the baskets was a small scrap of paper. She pulled it free. Nice try. Better luck next year? F. She stood and scanned the crowd. A dozen curious faces looked back, some amused, some annoyed. But one woman, a young brunette in a green apron, with flour still dusting her cheeks, stood with her arms behind her back, eyes wide and too bright. Helen gave her a small smile. Looks like someone's playing tricks, she said to the judge, but let's not jump to conclusions. She handed over the note. The judge read it, frowned, and asked Mr. Porter and Mrs. Thistlewhite to step aside for a civil conversation. Helen turned back toward the tent and found Sheriff Mike leaning against one of the support poles, sipping lemonade with a grin. Trouble follows you, he said. I prefer to think I follow it. He tilted his head. What do you think? Rival farmer sabotage? Helen shrugged. Feels more like a prank than a plot. But still, whoever F is, they weren't trying to win, just to cause a stir. He gestured toward the pie table. You know, there's a rumor someone plans to fake a pie entry in your name. Oh? Helen asked. Any guesses on what kind of pie? Rumor says lemon custard, with a hidden clue baked into the crust. Helen raised an eyebrow. Would this be the same rumor that ends with me finding a stolen county trophy hidden in the winner's tent? Mike grinned. Maybe. She chuckled. Foxglove is going to be a handful, isn't it? You'll fit right in. Later that evening, just before sunset, the fair began to wind down. Children clutched stuffed animals. The band struck up its final march, and Helen walked the grounds one last time, letting her feet carry her past vendor booths, prize banners, and the scent of funnel cakes. She ended at the edge of the livestock pavilion, where a sign read, Coming soon, Foxglove Fair's first annual mystery bake-off, hosted by Helen Lighthall. Someone had drawn her likeness in chalk on the bottom corner, complete with a detective's magnifying glass and a tray of pastries. Helen smiled. She turned to the dogs. Well, boys, looks like we're not retiring yet. Shadow wagged his tail. Halo barked once, chasing a drifting napkin across the grass. And somewhere in the fairgrounds, as stars began to blink into the deepening sky, a pie mysteriously vanished from the judging table. Someone would find it the next morning in the lost and found, missing one perfect slice. And folded inside the pie tin, on lemon-scented paper, would be a note. Nice try. Better luck next year. H.